and welcome to Depth Insights, where we take a depth psychological look at news, topics, and events that are going on in your world. I'm your host, Bonnie Bright, and I'm also the founder of Depth Psychology Alliance, which is an online academic community for everyone who is interested in the field of depth and Jungian psychologies. And we have an awesome community going on. It's now nearly 1,200 members, and there are all kinds of events, dialogues, conversations, study groups, and in fact there's also an online book club that is all free of charge, and you can join at any time at depthpsychologyalliance.com. Meanwhile, I'm excited for my guest today, Gary Bobroff, who has written a pretty remarkable book that we're going to be discussing. His book, Jung, Crop Circles, and the Re-Emergence of the Archetypal Feminine, is a unique topic, and I have some experience of my own that I can't wait to dig into with Gary. And then on March 23rd, we are going to be doing our very first local chapter meeting for Depth Psychology Alliance in the San Francisco Bay Area. And so Gary will be presenting to the group of us that gathered. But meanwhile, let me tell you just a bit about him. Gary has an undergraduate degree in philosophy and then did his master's degree in Jungian-oriented Psychology from Pacifica Graduate Institute, which many of our listeners know. And Gary has been able to visit crop circles in the UK, in Canada, and in the United States, and all of this, of course, has led to the culmination of this book, which is pretty new and, again, quite unique in the world. In addition to being a writer, Gary is also a therapist, and he leads workshops around the country in this particular topic. So, Gary, thank you for being with me. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Bonnie. I'm very happy to be here with you.
Well, I've been very intrigued by your book since the moment that I heard about it. And, in fact, right about the time that your book came out and my attention was drawn to it, I had the opportunity myself to visit some crop circles in the UK. I just happened to be planning a trip to the UK. It happened to be in July. And it's as you know, the high season for crop circles because the crops are pretty much the right height to be able to have the crop circles appear in them. And there's a lot about that many listeners probably don't know, so I don't want to get ahead of myself. But maybe we could just start and you could share a little bit about your interest in crop circles and what it is that has appealed to you and what led you to the place where you would actually do so much research and writing about them.
Thank you. Well, I want to kind of address my answers and the interview towards the Depth Psychology Alliance audience a bit and depth psychology folks in general, and a lot of those people will be Pacifica people, and they will know that I'm a Pacifica graduate and that I have taken a lot of similar courses from Pacifica that they have. So I was taking a course at Pacifica with Dr. Lionel Corbett, and I was reading Edinger's Creation of Consciousness, and I just had a flash that, you know, Jung talks a lot in Answer to Job about how the process of our relationship to the God image is a dynamic one. And here we are today in a special moment. I mean, he was very clear that we're in a moment of kairos when the unconscious man, the unconscious person inside of us is changing. And so I just was reading that book, and I had a flash on crop circles and how that's emblematic of this change. And I was lucky enough to have Willow Young at the time was the reader for that class, and she read a paper I wrote on crop circles as a sort of democratically available miracle, open to everyone, something that everyone can participate in that's numinous. And she said, oh, this would be a great book, which is not something people say all the time when you hand in an essay. So, and she's now a professor at Pacifica. And I ended up getting Lionel as my thesis advisor and writing on that topic for my thesis. So it's really, ballooned from a small inspiration into a book that I've spent years working on after it was done as a thesis. I spent many, many years really looking at the archetypal feminine and the goddess imagery and what that's about when you look at the symbol of grain and that sort of thing. So that's the core of the nugget with the Pacifica depth psychology insider view there.
Which I appreciate as well. But I'm really happy actually to hear that Lionel Corbett was involved in that because his fascination for the sacred and things that are larger than ourselves is really a passion for him, you can tell. And so I'm grateful for the container that I'm sure he created for you, as well as the encouragement and invitation from Willow Jung to continue your writing and pursue this path. However, what I want to say is there's a lot of skepticism around crop circles in general. And even most of us in the world of depth psychology, I think we are pretty open-minded to specific phenomena and certain things that are inexplicable, if you will. But in fact, in the first chapter of your book, you look at the science that is behind the crop circle phenomenon. So maybe you can talk about that and explain what your research is.
Right. And the broader Jungian community, definitely struggles with this. I propose going to speak to different organizations, and some are willing to go out there and try something new, and some are really skeptical as soon as you say crop circles. So the important thing to know is there is peer-reviewed scientific studies that show that there's an authentic mystery going on with crop circles. There are as many as 9 or maybe even more categories of evidence. There's cellular level change to the plants. There's biochemical changes in the plants. There's germinal changes in the seed. There's electromagnetic changes in not only the affected wheat, but in the affected soil as well. There is a study has been done on what's called crystallinity of the soil, and you can see a lot of these through my website. There's links to all these. So there's an amazing amount of science that's been done that shows that there's an authentic mystery going on. Absolutely, it's clear. And I certainly wouldn't have invested years of my life in pursuing a topic without being able to ground it in factual evidence. And in addition to that, there's history. There's archival records in England and elsewhere that go back hundreds of years talking about this phenomenon. There's reports all through the 20th century, World War II, farmers in the 20s and 30s. It goes way, way back. So this is not a phenomenon that can be blown off as a hoax, despite the sort of modern disbelief in anything existing beyond the sort of reductionist view of the world.
Right. Yeah, and what I really love about your book is the way that you, and your work in general, is the way that you have combined the actual phenomenon of the crop circles with the symbolic meaning as well, so that, people can actually take it on one level or the other if they need to do that in order to be able to engage with the material. But I will just say, actually, regarding the crop circles, I was quite skeptical myself. I've always had a fascination for them, but I also was quite skeptical, and I saw a film last spring. It's a documentary, which you probably are aware of, but I wanted to throw it out there for listeners who may be interested in seeing this. You can actually watch it online. It's called Crop Circles, Crossovers from Another Dimension. And it's just a really well-done documentary which explains a lot of the science as you have described it a bit here and the history of it. And I'll tell you something, that particular film made me really sit up and take a second look because it did a really good job of describing some of the science behind it, just as you have done in your book. But let's move forward because, behind the science is something, right? You mentioned the changes that have been documented actually to the wheat itself and some of the other physical evidence that has appeared within the crop circles themselves. What do you think, who or what do you think, I should say, is making the crop circles, and how is that important?
Right. Well, I really resist the focusing too much on the agency. Obviously, when we talk about it in my presentation, I talk about 3 general categories of response. There's people that obviously go to an extraterrestrial agency and think that it's something to do with other beings, whether that's dimensional or whatever you want to say. There's people that look at it as some sort of a spiritual agency, and there's people that talk about Earth, or many people have a combination of those 3 agencies as force behind the phenomenon. We're psychologists, and I'm not particularly interested in the agency. I'm interested, but I think as depth psychologists in particular, our quest is to look at the wholeness of our response. And there's a problem in the Western mind that we immediately jump to agency. We immediately jump to causation. Yep. And we want to do that because we want to put the phenomenon back in a little box. We've got the world reduced. We've taken all the mystery out of the world, and we put it in this little rational box, and that's a very tidy little box, and we like it that way. Whether that's a secular box or a religious box, this is the way the world works today. It wants to collapse all mystery into a category that it can live with and have less anxiety. And crop circles are a precise question posed exactly to deflate whatever tidy little box you think you have reality captured in. The genie is out of the bottle with this. So it's about our response. It's about how do we struggle with something that we don't know what's making it. How much of our psychological response do we really deal with? I've certainly run the gamut from denial and shadow and fear and a whole bunch of different things over the many, many years I've been looking at the phenomenon. And it's a process for everyone to the degree that you're willing to participate in that process. And for me, you've really got to look at primarily, I think, emotional response. You know, how do you feel emotionally in the face of the phenomenon? I mean, I have people at my presentations that are really, really physically almost blown away. You know, they've got everything tied down so tightly that when you open it up, it's almost overwhelming. So there's a process that goes on for each of us, and I think really the question is how much of your heart, how much of your feeling response are you willing to really sit with and participate with? I mean, that's the whole struggle. I mean, why is there even this, you know, a bias against the phenomenon? Where is that bias coming from?
Right.
You know, why do some people at some places not want to even have a presentation on it? Well, there's obviously something going on that they think it's outside of their, you know, if they were completely open-minded, they'd be willing to hear lots of things, right? So there's an emotional core there that's activated when you talk about this. And particularly, yes, depth psychologists, we are more open to soul and synchronicity and all these great things, but there's also, I think, probably more in the old school, but certainly it's around. There's a branch of depth psychology that wants to be very accepted by the mainstream world. And there's a branch of it that really says, hey, you know, our whole thing is that we're outside of that. So there's a struggle in our community that is really, I think, a psychological, emotional struggle primarily. So anyway, I think it's for all of us, and in my presentation I really get into more why that's important to deal with the emotion. And there's a deeper mystery there to that. I think there's a level at which, you know, we can understand the back and forth that humanity has with that phenomenon as really being a dynamic that's about feeling and about caring and about being interested and about being courageously going into the unknown. And there's some mysterious things that happen with the phenomenon that validate that hypothesis. And of course, that's the same thing that Jung talks about with synchronicity. You know, Jung's very clear, synchronicity happens through an emotional activation, not about a head trip. It's about when you bring your heart to the matter that strange things can start happening.
Yeah, I think what you're saying is very important. As a culture, we are not really conditioned to tolerate mystery, to tolerate this kind of unknown. And crop circles, I think, really present us with something that is so much bigger than our everyday ego selves, that when we are in the face of that, even as depth psychologists, but particularly the general public, how do we begin to come into some kind of relationship with something that is that big and that unknown? And I really love what you said about engaging with your heart, and I can only speak from experience, and I'm one of the very, I'm sure, small minorities that has been lucky enough to find myself in the center of one of these formations, sitting in a wheat field and just literally being completely overwhelmed by the, I guess I want to say, by the potentiality of what all that could mean and where it could possibly have come from. You know, it was just a little, for me, just a little tiny taste or a little tiny dip into that mystery. And every time I say that word or I hear you say it, I think of it with a capital M, of course. And you know, you pointed out the fact that some people really avoid kind of even, you know, walking that line where they might accidentally sort of tip over into that border. But Jung himself, of course, was, you know, he allowed himself to do that. And of course, his whole Red Book is pretty much the story of how he sort of allowed himself to step over that line into the mystery and what came of that. But I do think it's a really important point that the phenomenon really initiates a kind of self-reflection that is very profound and very powerful. And, of course, not all of the crop circles, so-called crop circles, are circles. There are some really remarkable and quite complex designs that appear or emerge. But I think there's probably something there about the circle that is also hugely symbolic. As we know, in depth psychology, Jungian psychology, the circle is a symbol of the self. And Jung did a tremendous amount of work with mandalas. So as someone who has studied the Jungian world quite heavily, do you see it that way? Is that part of your research, was the circle as the self?
Absolutely, for sure. Well, there's two essential pieces that are kind of obvious to the depth psychologist, but maybe they're not obvious to everyone. But clearly, when you have a phenomenon that is so geocentric, it's called crop circles. They did originally be predominantly rings and circles in that sort of form. And throughout the evolution of the form, the phenomenon, there is this general geocentric principle, which, of course, we're lucky we have Jung to tell us all about the archetype of the self and to talk about how in the psyche, when we're out of balance, it produces images of the self as a way to move us towards reintegration. And, of course, we very much are out of balance. And the other piece here, of course, is it's in grain, it's in wheat, it's in living grain. And that is obviously a symbol of the archetypal feminine, and we have the goddess mysteries and all that as a way to understand that. And so that's really what my book is about, and what the presentation is about, is those two things. The self urging us back towards balance, and what kind of balance is it urging us back towards? Well, back to the organic, biological nature of the self. You know, plant symbols point downwards. They point down to the earth, to the context of our real lives. They point to the body. They point to the earth that we live on. I mean, clearly we're in a culture that is run amok and is inflated and grandiose on an archetypal masculine ego trip that is killing us. And here we have this, whatever it is, whether you want to call it an intervention of the gods or whatever you want to call it, we have something psychologically pointing us towards a different direction, and a direction that is down, out of our heads, into the ground, into the earth, and something that is talking about the miracle of life, which is clearly something that we've lost in our kind of abstract and intellectual view of the world that has lost the reality. And we're lucky we have Jung to offer a real solid approach to this phenomenon that's psychological, and a route to understand this mystery without categorizing it, without imagining that we've solved it. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, definitely. You know, it's almost like the crop circles are sort of a wake-up call, a compass that is kind of saying, hey, there's something going on here. And this image of the grain is really important because, as you stated, there's the whole thing about it being the plant, and it's organic, and it's living, and it's growing. But there's so much rich symbolism that is involved in that. And, of course, the circles can appear in cornfields as well. I typically think of wheat. But regardless, there is definitely something that's going on there. And I remember looking on your website the very first time. It's been a long time ago now. Of course, your website is jungandcropcircles.net. On your website, you have these images that were painted by a woman in the 1950s, and I believe she was a British therapist herself, and she was also in analysis with Tony Wolff, who was, of course, a longtime colleague and very close to Jung. And these images, each one of them in this series of paintings includes the grain, and usually a woman in this field of grain, and then some kind of relationship to or connection to UFOs or the paranormal in that sense.
Yeah.
I mean, those visually are very compelling, and I invite everybody to go take a look at your website at jungandcropcircles.net and just check those paintings out, because even just looking at those paintings really did something for me as well, and I suspect that they were a huge source of inspiration for you as you went into this work. Do you want to talk about a little bit more about this woman?
Sure. I think it's particularly interesting for the depth psychological folks to have this information on Champernoun, and I do go into it in more detail in the book, of course, and in the presentation. And I just want to mention, too, you had talked about the grain. You know, in the formation of a crop circle, in an authentic formation, the grain is still alive. The root node is bent at 90 degrees. Where it was standing straight up, it's now straight to the ground. You have what was a straight 180 degree is now 90 degree bend, as if someone whispered to the wheat, bend over at a 90 degree angle. The wheat is still alive. What was straight up is now bent to the ground, and the nodes are stretched and sometimes blown out or elongated. But the plants are still alive. So I think that's a very important point. So to get into the Champernoun, after I was done the thesis at Pacifica, I was taking a class at CIIS with Rick Tarnas, who's one of the people that really helped me with this work. His ideas helped me, not him personally. But I went to the library at Pacifica and randomly, looking for information on Tony Wolff, found this pamphlet. What's in this pamphlet? It's called A Memoir of Tony Wolff, and it's written by Irene Champernoun, who's one of the founders of art therapy. And she had, in 1950, and I believe a few years before and after that, right up to Tony's death in 1953, she was working with Tony Wolff as her analyst. And she had a series of dreams and visions which were very powerful to her, and she painted these images and sent them to Zurich, to Tony, and Tony sent her back letters talking about the images, and they are very powerful. And one of the primary first one is two women standing on a hill, an older and a younger, looking down on a large white silver spinning object, peopled on the edge of it, like a UFO, and she refers to it as a UFO. And throughout this series of images, you have this UFO context, you have swirled grain and feminine, and Tony, of course, spoke to her in her letters of the return to the feminine in our era and what that was about, and was really struck by the power of these images. In fact, these images were so powerful that after Tony passed away in 1953, Irene flew to Zurich to get the paintings and sat with Emma Jung and C.G. Jung. And Emma told her that she felt that there was something in these images for the collective. And C.G. sat with her and showed her an image of Jacob Boehme, which was referred to the two sides, the yin and the yang, the archetypal feminine and masculine of life. And they had a conversation about the re-emergence of the feminine in our moment. And so we get from these images and from this pamphlet that I found completely randomly, after the thesis was done, we get Jung's and Emma Jung's and Tony Wolff's, as close as we're going to get to them commenting on crop circles. And the images are very similar. They're not an exact layover, but especially archetypally extraordinarily similar. And this woman is living in the English countryside.
Right.
Yeah,
I think, you say you randomly found these things. Of course, we both know you're talking about synchronicity because there's just, the chances are pretty slim. But
right.
I find that to be a really remarkable sort of validation for those of us who have been so touched by Jung's work and really revere him as quite a remarkable mind in this field. The fact that he would be able to tap into that and sort of validate that, as well as Emma, actually, because both Emma Jung and Tony Wolff not only had a strong influence on C.G. Jung, as we know, but they were quite remarkable women in their own right. And I really like to think that some of this emerged amongst the women, really, between Irene Champernoun and Tony Wolff, and then having the validation from Emma, who was involved in that ending part, is really... really a lovely way to kind of put in perspective the whole symbolism of the archetypal feminine, and as you point out, its meaning as it begins to emerge more in our culture that has been quite patriarchally repressive. So that's really great.
Yeah, and my understanding, and I believe this is correct, is that in the opening foyer at the Zurich Psychological Club, there was 3 portraits that hung. There was Jung's, Emma's, and Tony's. So he knew who was important and how important they were. Indeed,
yes. Well, you mentioned again, we were just talking about the synchronicity of you coming across this brochure randomly, and of course in the book you write a lot about synchronicity, and I know there's also a lot of synchronicities that happen between people who are researching the crop circle phenomenon and the formations that occur. So can you just talk about how that comes to play in all of this?
Well, again, I would want to say that, one of the big misconceptions about synchronicity is that it's some kind of mental trip, and it's not. Jung was very clear, and there's medieval writers that talk about this as well, synchronicity, and we know this from extended mind phenomenon too that Sheldrake writes about, but synchronicity in Jung's experience and in all these other thinkers' experience has to do with feeling, has to do with heart, has to do with emotional activation. And so there is a history, and it's very interesting to me, that researchers of crop circles have this history of when they are emotionally engaged with the phenomenon, getting some kind of response from the phenomenon. You know, you could look at me finding that pamphlet being an example of that, but more clearly to get the emotion in focus, there was one famous researcher of crop circles 1 year early on couldn't afford to travel the distances to go and look at every formation, and he got one very close to his home. There's many other instances, and I give one in the presentation that's quite dramatic, where the researchers are emotionally activated in their pursuit. Something happens where there are these innumerable incidences of formations occurring in response to that emotion, which is quite interesting to me, and again, just is a kind of reflects the importance of keeping in mind with synchronicity that it feeds back to the importance of the synchronicity phenomenon too. And I really look at both synchronicity and crop circles as part of diamonds in the crown of the re-emergence of the feminine in this time, because what we need to understand and what we're learning in this moment is that the heart is engaged with the world, that psyche and matter are of one fabric, and that the heart is being brought back. You know, one of the ways that you can understand our time, and von Franz talks about this, is that, and so does Jung, of course, but she says it specifically, we're in a moment where spirit and matter have been split apart and getting split apart more and more and more and pushed apart more and more and more. And she says, how are spirit and matter brought back together? Through the heart. Mm-hmm. And to me, synchronicity shows you that. I mean, when a synchronicity happens, your heart, your emotional involvement with the world is bringing something into occurrence. How profound, mm-hmm. and how completely different that is to our masculine reductionist view of the world that sees absolutely no participation with emotion with anything outside the body. It's the re-infusion of mystery into our view of the world, and synchronicity does that, and crop circles do that. And I think, I mean, to really fill out the picture, I think those phenomenon are these miracles, these positive, wonderful, deep things that we can chew on. It. For me, those are the light side of the coin. And the dark side of the coin, of course, is all the tragedy, all the things we're doing to the planet, all the ways, you know, all the things that the masculine is killing the world, killing us through. That's the dark side of the coin. So, but for me, they all point in this direction of down, back into the body, back into the heart, caring about what's going on, living our real lives, participating with the tragedy and the mystery that we experience, you know, for ourselves.
Right. I absolutely agree with you. I've done quite a lot of research on this concept of longing, and particularly the sense of longing for something, to be connected to something that is bigger than us. And that thing that is bigger than us is nature. It is the planet. It is Earth. It is the sacred. There's a lot of names for it. In the end, it's kind of all the same force. But I believe that the way that you're describing synchronicity plays into that completely, and that is that engagement with the heart and that sense of connection and belonging, you know, longing and belonging that comes through that. And actually what you've just said speaks completely to my experience when I was inside several of those crop circles. And that sense of just belonging in a place or being connected with something that is larger. I mean, I don't know what that is. I couldn't even put a label or words to it. I wouldn't be willing to, you know. But it's a sense of something being fulfilled in me because I was able to somehow open my mind enough, even though it was probably a very small portion, but open my mind enough to feel that there, you know, and allow that something to exist and to be bigger. Mm-hmm. So that's the experience that I also feel just from your work and from the book and from what you share here today. And that leads me to ask you, Gary, how has this work changed your life?
Oh, wow. Well, it's it's really, it's so deep. It's incredibly profound to be kind of the the mid-husband of people's experience of this. I mean, people have strong reactions, and luckily, I knock wood, I have yet to have too many negative ones. But when people really sit through my whole presentation or read my book, and they get grounded in the factual reality, a process of opening up goes on for them, which is it's like birth. It's like being a midwife of a numinous experience for people, and certainly it's more numinous to have the experience like you had, to actually be in a crop circle and feel connected to something larger, which of course is so similar to what people describe in the goddess mysteries of the ancient world, a reconnection to source, which our culture is so devoid of. So for me to be sort of like the Telemachus from the Greek mysteries, the son of the goddess, going around putting this out there to people is very, very profound and very demanding and very profound. I mean, it's really forced me to kind of be my best and be as real as I can be, and really brought out a lot of qualities in me that I'm very happy to be forced to engage. But it's very moving. I feel very lucky. I feel humble about it. I feel it's really about people's process and their engagement with the phenomenon, which doesn't really have to do with me. I mean, I'm kind of the waiter bringing the food, so I just try and keep it on people's process. And it's a wonderful thing to be doing, and I'm very happy, and it's really rewarding, and I feel happy to have done it and lucky. It's a deep question. I could probably talk about that for a long time.
Yeah, I hear you. I understand. And I think it's really remarkable depth work, because you're carrying something that, as you said when you began, it doesn't really have an explanation. There isn't really something that we can point to and say this is the cause. And so what you actually are doing through all of this, I believe, is holding the mystery, holding a container for the mystery, so that the rest of us can tap into that. And I really appreciate that. And I'm very excited because I am finally going to get to see you in person. As we wrap this up, I just want to make sure that everybody who's listening knows that you have several upcoming events, actually, and you managed to get around quite a bit, at least on the West Coast, I know. Coming up in February, you have on February 24th an event in Ojai, California. Then the next day on the 25th in Topanga, California. And then on March 23rd, I'm so thrilled, we are going to be doing our very first local chapter meeting for the Depth Psychology Alliance, first one ever, and that is going to be in the San Francisco Bay Area. And so on March 23rd, you will be traveling here and presenting to the group of us that gathers here. And so everyone can find more information about you both on your website at www.jungandcropcircles.net, as well as on your Facebook page, which is facebook.com/Jung and Crop Circles. And, of course, Gary, I mean, again, I just think your work is really remarkable. And apparently I'm not the only one, because I know you worked with Anne Baring quite a bit, and she has called your book a tremendous achievement, calling it clear, lucid, and comprehensive. And also, you presented recently at the Analytical Psychology Society in New York, and I just wanted to read this comment that Frank Burskins said. He's the president there, and he said, Gary Bobroff delivered an engaging lecture and follow-up workshop that inspired and challenged believers and skeptics alike. Gary's in-depth research from both a scientific and Jungian perspective successfully bridged preconceived notions to access the unconscious realm, a feat seldom executed in such an authentic manner. As an organization, we were concerned that the topic would limit participation, yet the program generated record turnout for both lecture and workshop. Gary is a gifted presenter whose presence and perspective is destined to grow in popularity. I highly recommend Gary to any organization willing to stretch and explore the shadow in a creative and innovative manner. Wow. So I thought that pretty much said it all, and I'm just absolutely thrilled and looking forward to being able to meet you and listen to your presentation on March 23rd in the San Francisco area. People can find out more information about that event on either depthinsights.com or depthpsychologyalliance.com, and then I presume you will have them listed on your website as well at jungandcropcircles.net. And again, the book is Jung, Crop Circles, and the Re-Emergence of the Archetypal Feminine. I've been talking with Gary Bobroff. And Gary, thank you so much for your time. I just so appreciate it.
Thank you, Bonnie. That was great.
Thank you.
Bye.